The transfer portal is closed, and Tennessee football will come out of the transfer sweepstakes in better situation than some of its peers in that the Vols didn't lose as many players to the portal as is often the case around the country nowadays in this transfer era. Welcome into this edition of the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside Adam Sparks. Always seems like whatever program you're following, if you're a fan, media type, whatever, it probably always seems like, hey, a lot of guys are transferring. What's the deal here, right? But like that happens everywhere, and so all of this is relative. What is quote unquote a lot of guys transferring really probably means 20 plus guys. If you're losing fewer than 20 players, right, you're actually not doing too bad in terms of player retention. So what is the situation for Tennessee with the window closed, meaning that Tennessee can still add players who are in the portal, but they're not going to lose anyone else to the transfer portal that is closed to new entries?
Yeah, we've talked about in the past who they've added. Some guys in the secondary, especially. They added offensive tackle in the early portal back in the winter, but most of their work is done. They could still add a running back. I just don't see that happening. The big news is since the portal is closed, we can see, and that's close to new players going in. We can see how few that Tennessee lost. If you look at the SEC numbers, Tennessee has lost the fewest of any SEC school. That's 15 if you add the winter portal and the spring portal together. Now, I will say of those 15, I think like 12 are scholarship players. But that goes for everybody. Everybody has some walk-ons that go into the portal. But in the SEC, you go as high as 39 with Alabama. You can go, there's like 3 schools in the 30s. Most schools are in the 20s. The only schools that are in the teens of guys departing are Missouri at 19 and Tennessee at 15. So again, Tennessee has lost the fewest. The average is about 25 in the SEC. So Tennessee's 10 under that. Every time I post a story about a guy going into the portal from Tennessee, and in the spring window, there were only 2, Christian Conyer, Elijah Herring. Every time I post one of those, I always get messages from readers, from UT fans that ask, what's the problem? Like, well, these guys are dropping like flies. What's is this a culture problem? Is it not enough NIL money? And my answer is still always the same. Like, this is college football. You got to get used to it. You can't judge it like you did like 5 years ago or 10 years ago. You're going to lose a lot of guys. Tennessee has lost the fewest. And so I think really the question is like, why did anybody leave Tennessee? It's why did they lose so few? And I think that's a reasonable question. I mean, in number one, I would say is that there's a good NIL situation at Tennessee, at least in terms of stability, that's not at other places. Whether it's complete reality or it's just perception, Tennessee does have the perception. It's NIL Collective, which is the Vol Club or Spire Sports. It's the same entity. The perception is that the NIL Collective at Tennessee pays well or pays fairly for what the market value is, and also pays on time. So you do see, like around the conference a little bit, certainly around college football, you have some collectives that have the reputation of not paying what they promised, or pay what the player thought was in the contract. There's some swindling going on there. Or at least that's the perception. Perception of Tennessee is they pay and they pay on time. So that leads players to not really have a motive to leave just for NIL purposes. And I think that's, if that's not the top reason, I think that's certainly one of the top 2 or 3.
Yeah, and yet I'm also struck by when you were rattling off some of the programs that lost the most players in the portal, like Alabama's near the top of the list, right? And so, Alabama probably doesn't have the industry's leading NIL collective, but they're believed to have a pretty good collective, top 10, top 15 in the sport. We don't know the exact numbers of these types of things, but anecdotally, that's sort of the reputation Alabama's NIL collective has. So sort of what you're alluding to there, NIL obviously matters when it comes to retaining your programs, and it seems to, or retaining your players, and it seems to be a feather in Tennessee's cap. But I also think, and you're probably going here next, right, is that like coach retention seems to be maybe the biggest thing that can sway your portal numbers. If you lose your coach, you're going to be near the head of the pack, right, in terms of having players leave. Because before the transfer era, when players had to sit out, underclassmen anyway, after transferring, maybe they'd give the new coach a chance and stick around and play a season with the new coach and then transfer if they don't see it working out. Now, some guys will still do that, but a lot of guys aren't waiting around to give the new guy a chance. Coach leaves, coach retires, coach is fired. They're in the portal, not waiting around to see what it's like with the new guy. And Tennessee, for more than a decade was cycling through coaches, but now they found some stability on that front. So I have to imagine that helps as well. Yes.
Yeah, I mean Tennessee right now is a retention program. They've retained their head coach now going into his fourth season. He's retained assistants. If you look at Josh Heupel's 10 assistants right now, 6 of them were on his original staff. 2 of them were promoted internally. So you really got 8 of 10 guys that have been here virtually the whole time. And then the 2 new guys were just added like in the last 2 months. So players are not having to think about if my position coach leaves or the coordinator leaves, should I also leave? They get the same coach year after year. And even when they have a different coach, it's the guy that was working with them on the side anyway. So head coach retained, assistant coaches retained. And I think that sort of filters down to the players. Like if you think about one of the major moves that Tennessee made this offseason with its roster, it was retaining offensive linemen, really O linemen and D linemen, retaining them to those guys that were like 6th year or 5th year COVID guys. Most of the offensive and defensive line really is in that category. It's guys that instead of going into the portal, Tennessee, instead of going in the portal and getting new O linemen, D linemen, they just said, hey, we'll just re-up the guys that we have. So the strategy is retention. What you know and what you feel comfortable with, you retain those. And that's not the case in a number of ways around the SEC. And it's not entirely every school's fault that they end up this way. But if you look at, I mentioned Alabama led with 39 departures. That's a new coach. A&M was second with 31 departures. That's a new coach. Mississippi State lost 25 guys. That's a new coach. And it is not just it's not just new coaches. It's like the expectation of a new coach. Arkansas was number 2 with 31 departures. That's a hot seat coach. Mm-hmm. Vandy lost 25. That's probably a hot seat coach. Florida lost 23. It's a hot seat coach. So it's guys that are either gone or guys that are on shaky ground. And I'm not saying that's everybody, but I think you can shave a few guys off of a roster when guys look around and say, my coach is gone, or my coach is on shaky ground and I don't know if he's going to last a year. Maybe I need to get somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting with this, because guys transfer from a number of reasons. We know this. We know there's allegations of tampering, and it goes beyond allegations, right? I mean, it's just reality. Tampering's going on. A guy will hop into the portal and see if he can get a better deal elsewhere. That's happening. We know it. And to a certain extent, that can be kind of exhausting for college football fans. And yet, I think what we're hitting on here is like the biggest reason players transfers are their coach gets fired, or their coach leaves, or their coach is going to get fired. And so, for all this, the talk about this, players these days, they don't have any commitment, they don't have any loyalty. Maybe that's true if you compare it to players of 30 years ago, but also coaches, the turnover rate among coaches, I think if you compared that to coaches from 30, 40 years ago, the turnover rate of coaches is higher. And if you want to slow down transfers, don't fire your coach, keep your coach, win ball games, and you're not going to eliminate transfers, but you're going to slow it down, which is what we've seen from Tennessee. 3 straight winning seasons under Josh Heupel. Last 2 seasons in particular, show positive momentum. No head coaching change. And like you said, a lot of the assistants even are sticking around. So you can't eliminate transfers. You can fight against them by having a reputable NIL program and some stability in your coaching staff.
Yeah, I think the landscape of college football with the portal really, it really tests that old cliche of you're not committing to, or you're not signing with the coach. You're signing with the school, which was always ridiculous. You know, you you're going to where you have a relationship with the coach. You're committing to him and his staff and somewhat that program. You're not committing to because you like the chemistry department or you like the layout of campus or any of this nonsense. And so when coaches leave, suddenly players think about leaving. And I think coaching changes, especially at the top, but also with assistant coaches, position coaches. I think it doesn't necessarily lead a ton of guys to get into the portal, but it makes guys question that. If you're a wide receiver, you're one of 10 wide receivers on a team, and your position coach leaves, and another guy's coming in that you don't know. You may have not thought about leaving, but you're at least going to sit back and think, okay, let me just reevaluate this. I loved the last guy. Do I like the new guy? Will I like the new guy? How long will I wait? Maybe I should look around. Who was my second choice when I committed back out of high school? Do I have a better relationship with that guy than maybe I will the new guy here? By the way, while I'm thinking about it, let me reevaluate financially where I'm at. I get paid this much NIL money. Is the new guy going to speak up for me to get more NIL money because he doesn't know me? But I would probably have a higher value if I went into the portal and demanded more NIL money elsewhere. By the way, where's my position coach going? Is he going to a better program where he could take me? I think it's not that guys leave, but I think they always leave in those situations. But I think guys sit back and consider leaving when that happens. And with Tennessee, they just haven't really lost assistants in that way. I mean, they lost a wide receiver coach 2 years ago to the NFL. That didn't really change a whole lot. And they promoted Kelsey Pope, who was already on the staff. Alex Golish left. He became a head coach at South Florida. Now, a couple of guys have gone into the portal from Tennessee and gone to South Florida over the last 2 years, but it wasn't anybody that Tennessee was necessarily needing terribly bad. So they just haven't had guys that have made lateral moves. And Josh Heupel, I always wonder if players really know this much. Maybe it's in the reputation. But Josh Heupel has the reputation of keeping guys. I mean, Josh Heupel has never fired an assistant coach. And I think some of that has to get in the osmosis into the program of that. Like, he doesn't let guys go. Guys don't leave for lateral moves. And so I think there's just this whole atmosphere, whole environment about the program is you come here and you stay. It's a little more old school. It's a little more pre-NIL, pre-portal. Now, Tennessee, again, it's not like they lost nobody. They lost 15 guys. I think, like I said, 12 that are scholarship guys. But it's really hard to look at the guys that they lost and say, wow, they really didn't want to lose that guy. There's 2 or 3. But for the most part, guys that left, Tennessee was fine with those guys leaving.
Yeah, and as we talk about this, I'm kind of struck by the old cliche of people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses. And I mean, that seems to apply in the football world as well. Now, there are exceptions to that rule in the professional workforce, and there are also exceptions to that rule in college football, but it does seem to have some application of when players leave in mass in college football, it's because there's been a change in the boss, either at the head coaching level or at the very least, a position coach changes, and that causes players to reevaluate their situation of, do I want to stick around for the new boss? Or, as you said, is this time to kind of test the waters, see what else might be out there, and see if there's another situation that resonates for me? Want to get into maybe you mentioned not the most notable losses that we've seen around the conference, but there are still some more notable than others. Want to get into that in a moment, but first, do you see any other, I guess, main prevailing reasons? We've talked about coach retention, assistant coach retention. We've talked about the health of the Tennessee's NIL. Do you see any other reasons jump out as to why Tennessee might be doing it better than most in terms of player retention?
Yeah, I've got a couple, and I'll really just combine these into sort of one conversation. Tennessee under Josh Heupel is really sort of in that sweet spot of between when a lot of guys leave because of the coaching change from Jeremy Pruitt to Josh Heupel, in between that and the program getting stale. When Josh Heupel came in, I forget the number. It was like 25, 26, 30, something like that. Guys, just a mass exodus that happened in a way that Alabama is now experiencing. You change coaches, a lot of guys leave. So that happened when Josh Heupel came in and replaced Jeremy Pruitt. And then it hasn't really happened since then. Sometimes the next wave of guys leaving happens when the program gets stale. Sometimes that can be like year 4, year 5, year 6. South Carolina lost 27 guys this offseason. That seems like a program to me that was maybe starting an upward trajectory and then has tailed off a little bit. I think you could see programs like that. Oklahoma lost 25 guys. I think they're sort of in is this a really good program or is this an okay program under Brent Venables? Josh Heupel, Tennessee under Josh Heupel has not hit that wall yet. So they're in the sweet spot between, hey, everybody left because there's a new coach, and hey, things are a little stale here. I think I'll go try something different. And the reason that they're in that sweet spot is because they haven't lost enough yet. They've won at a reasonable degree. Josh Heupel went from 7 wins to 11 wins to, what was it last year, 10 wins to this year, a projection of 9 or 10 wins. He got to a good level and he's kept it there. And so I think there's a feeling within the program of I'm gonna hang on. I'm gonna see kind of where this goes. I think this is a winner. I don't think I want to jump ship right now. Where if they had peaked at 11 wins a couple years ago and then tailed off to like 7 or 8 last year, and then maybe the quarterback situation wasn't as good as it is with Nico, then you have some doubts. I just think the level of winning that they've had so far, and also the level of retention, has led a lot of players to say, I think this is kind of headed in the right direction. I think I'm going to hang on.
So as we look at these 15 departures, you mentioned a few walk-ons mixed in there, but we run down this, and I don't see a player that it's like, oh, I don't know how they overcome the loss of that player, or even just a notable departure. I mean, like I look at a program like Ole Miss, and yeah, Ole Miss has done a great job once again at adding talent, but they did lose some guys too, including their star running back Quinshon Judkins, who transferred to Ohio State. You look at Alabama, it's not just the number of departures at Alabama, but they lost Caleb Downs, their All-America safety. He transferred to Ohio State. Isaiah Bond, who would have been their best returning wide receiver, he transferred to Texas. So at some places, it's not just quantity, it's also quality of guys that have left. And I think as I look at Tennessee's situation, they did a really good job of limiting the quantity of transfers, but also limiting the quality of outbound transfers. So for me, it's less about one particular player and more, I'm struck by how many defensive backs they lost. And I know these guys, a lot of them, really probably all of them, you could say were not high level, elite level performers. But I do wonder about the abundance of new faces in the secondary this year. I know there's, I think some hope, at least among Vols fans, that new faces will help elevate that product that had sort of hit a ceiling with some of those veteran guys that had seemingly been around the program forever and now transferred out. But I do wonder if there is a concern about the transfers. It's the number of defensive backs they lost. Would they have liked to have kept a Tamarian McDonald or one of those veterans to help provide some familiarity within that secondary? What jumps out to you about these 15 guys who are out the door?
Yeah, I think especially in the secondary, I think we're in the sort of to be determined. That's the thought that I have of whether or not it was a completely good move to lose all those guys in the secondary. They lost Tamarian McDonald. I think he's at Louisville now. He's jumped at a couple different schools, but he played the star position. Like, is Jordan Thomas about the same as Tamarian McDonald? That's a possibility. We'll probably know a few games into the season, but it's a reasonable argument. They lost Danico Slaughter. He was solid at corner. A lot of these guys are solid, adequate, serviceable. All these adjectives that we can put on it. That's like not bad, but not really good. Is Danico Slaughter better or worse than Jermod McCoy, a younger transfer with more upside that they got from Oregon State? I suspect Jermod McCoy will be better in the long run. Will he be better this season? It's a reasonable question. Wesley Walker, although he was a safety, he sort of looks like what they got in Jalen McMurray, who is a transfer out of Temple. If you look at a lot of these guys, where they got them and where they ended up, I mean, the secondary guys, they went to Louisville, Arkansas, another one to Louisville. Brandon Turnage went to Ole Miss. Warren Burrell went to Georgia Tech. Like, these are all sort of schools that, aside from Ole Miss, these are all schools that are like a half a step below Tennessee. So it sort of tells you, like, they were serviceable, solid at Tennessee. They went somewhere where they will be viewed slightly better than solid. So they're sort of going down a half a step, which is where a lot of these guys, I think, where the market said they were. And even beyond that, you look at like a linebacker, Elijah Herring, who led Tennessee in tackles last year, but there were some holes in his game, and we've talked about that before. He announced just a few days ago he's transferring to Memphis. Well, that's okay program, but that's not Tennessee. And so the market told him, hey, we think you're about at this American Athletic Conference level, an AAC level. And that's where a lot of these guys are. Gerald Mincey ended up at Kentucky. Kentucky's solid, but Kentucky's a half a step below Tennessee, I think we can say. And so a lot of these guys ended up sort of maybe where they should have been. Tennessee upgraded at offensive tackle. They lost Mincey. They got Lance Hurd, who's a 5-star level player. I think he's going to be a really good left tackle. They lost all these guys in the secondary, and really they're going to miss them if they need depth. They lost Elijah Herring. They will miss him if they need depth, if there's injuries there. And so it's really to be determined. But if you lose the guys that we named off and we pointed out, and then you point out who replaced them, I think Tennessee ended up pretty well. They actually added fewer than they lost, and they lost very few. So again, you have the stability, you have the retention, but you are very selective in what you added. When you look at a program like Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin is doing this experiment of like, can I get to the playoff with a team full of free agents? And we'll see. I'm terribly intrigued to see if that experiment works. Tennessee went the opposite route and said, hey, if I shave off some pieces that I really don't need and I selectively add fewer guys to fill those spots, does that selection and retention, does that keep things together a little better? They're sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. Tennessee and Ole Miss were similar teams last year, I think, in their level, and I think they probably will be this year. But one of them said, we're going to hold this thing together and just add a few pieces here and there. And the other one, Ole Miss, said, we're going to reboot, and we're just going to go find a team. And we'll see which one works, because they have similar coaches. At least they're what they're good at with offense, and the rosters were similar last year, but they're going to look quite different.
Yeah, and I'm struck maybe by an additional reason as to why, as you were talking there, as to why Tennessee doesn't lose as many transfers as some of its peers. It's because they also don't add as many transfers as some of their peers. There's only so many scholarship spots on the roster. If you're doing it Portal King mode, like Lane Kiffin does, and bringing in 30 transfers, well, you're going to be losing more transfers than what Tennessee has lost as well. So there's a couple different ways to do it. It's sign, retain, and build with what you have, develop with what you have, and try to use transfers to fill in the cracks. Or it's 30 guys in, 30 guys out. And I actually think it can work either way. It's not a guarantee to work either way, but I think there are multiple ways of doing this. And I think both Tennessee and Ole Miss will be playoff contenders this year, despite doing it two fairly differently. It's really a 180 of each other, as you were describing the way they build.
And I wonder, I would love to see the books of all these collectives, which I'm sure we never will get to see. But, you hear like the NIL budgets of the top programs, it's 12 million or 15 million or 20 million or whatever it is now. If you're adding very few guys, you think of this as a payroll. If I'm trimming off 12 guys and I'm adding 8 guys or whatever it is Tennessee added, I don't really have to change the books much. It's almost like you look across the board and you say, "Hey, everybody gets your 5% cost of living raise." And then we shaved off these guys, and so we've got this little pot over here to go get these 5, 6, 7 players. If you're losing 30 guys and you're adding 30 guys, let's go back to my original point. Tennessee's collective has a reputation of paying well, or paying fairly, and paying on time. If I know on my budget, I just have to tweak a number here and there and bump up a handful of guys each year, it's a little easier to pay fairly and pay on time rather than if you're switching out 30 guys for 30 new guys. Because if you're doing the latter strategy, you may end up in Brian Kelly territory where you've got a 5-figure number and that guy wants a 6-figure number, or you got a 6-figure number and that guy wants a 7-figure number. Well, we didn't figure on that. Well, maybe you shouldn't lose 30 guys. Then you're probably not going to have that unknown hanging out there. And so I think Tennessee has fewer unknowns. I think that's what Josh Heupel likes. But I think also it probably helps and just guessing, educated guess here, that I think it probably helps the NIL collective have some stability as well.
All right, so let's close with what's coming in the door. You mentioned a couple key ones there. Lance Hurd, the offensive tackle, came in from LSU. He should be an immediate contributor. Jermon McCoy will be an important piece, cornerback from Oregon State. And then also Chris Brazzell, the wide receiver from Tulane, was a very good player for Tulane and should fit in nicely to this offense as well. Of course, some other important faces as well, but those are 3 big ones. But you mentioned earlier that, well, maybe they could still get a running back, maybe not. And we know the portal is closed to new entries. We know a lot of the best talent in the portal has already found their new destination. But if there is a spot where you think Tennessee can further supplement, gain another transfer or two, do you see that occurring at any particular position, or do you think the reality is Tennessee might be done in terms of adding transfers at this stage?
I know they've looked at lower level running backs as a possibility. Boy, my mind escapes me as you're wearing a Truman State T-shirt. I believe that is the running back for Mizzou last year.
Yeah, Cody Schrader.
Yeah, Cody Schrader. I think that I think they've kicked the tires a little bit on some like lower level, like D2, 1AA type guys, FCS guys, I guess we call them now. They've looked at those as a possibility, maybe for depth, and I could see maybe them adding somebody like that through the summer, but I don't see them going out throwing some NIL money at a guy that's going to be anywhere comparable to number 1, Dylan Sampson, their RB1, their starter, and number 2, Cam Seldon, who's sitting out with an injury. I asked Josh Heupel at a Big Orange Caravan event not long ago, maybe last week, about Cam Seldon and his injury. He's going to be the backup running back once he gets back, but he has a shoulder injury he suffered in spring. He's going to get back, it looks like probably like maybe late August, probably early September, so I could see him missing a couple games. But when I asked about his rehab, Josh Heupel lit up, really wanting to emphasize that, hey, he's ahead of schedule. He's doing great. We think he's going to be out there. He's going to help us. And so that body language told me that they're happy with what they have in the short term, which tells me they're probably not going to add a running back. But if they did, it would be a guy that would not threaten the room. In other words, it would be a guy that would not look like a challenge to Dylan Sampson's starting job. I think Sampson's going to have a great year. I don't think it's going to be a guy like that or that costs NIL money. And it's probably not going to be a guy that tells Cam Seldon, hey, you better get back from your injury or you're going to lose your number 2 job. I think if they added a guy, it would be sort of a depth piece just to have another body out there. But I'm not even sure if they're going to do that.
All right, you can find all of Adam's coverage on the off-season comings and goings over at KnoxNews.com. Also, check out his updates from the Big Orange Caravan in his conversations with Josh Heupel from the road there. And we will be back with you later this month for another edition. Thanks for listening to this installment of the Volunteer State.